Today's lesson is, I believe, the fourth in a series of lessons that are sort of centered around chord voicing. In lesson 19, if I'm not mistaken, we discussed inversions. And then in lesson 20, we discussed how ways we can use chord voicing to make our playing more interesting. And in the last lesson, we kind of dug deep to see how we could begin to use chord voicing to make our playing easier. And this lesson is sort of a continuation on that theme. And what we're going to do is we're going to just sort of apply what we've learned to just a couple of chord progressions. Now, for anyone who is not familiar with chord progressions, you may want to go back and watch lesson number 9. It was a whiteboard lesson. And we discussed what chord progressions are, how they're used, and I also went over several chord progressions, and hopefully those of you who have watched that lesson wrote those progressions down. But for anyone who didn't watch that lesson, I think it would be very helpful for you to go back and at the very least, there's a lot of examples of chord progressions given. And I think it would really help you to begin to practice playing those chord progressions. So as I said, we're only going to look at a couple of chord progressions just to sort of show how we can use these tools to make things a little easier. So the first chord progression I want to look at is the 1-4-5 chord progression. And maybe you could write that down on your piece of paper, 1-4-5. And essentially the numbers refer to the notes of the C major scale or whatever key you're working in. But we're working in C major. So that's what those numbers refer to. So the 1 chord in the key of C major is C major because C is the first note of the scale. And the 4 chord, the fourth note of the scale is F. So the 4 chord is F major. And the 5 chord is G major. So if we just start out in the place that I usually like to start out with, and that's with our root note B string C major chord, where we have the root note under our index finger at the 1st fret, and we're playing open strings on the on the G and the E strings. We'll have the C major chord. So the next chord in our progression is the F major chord. And what we really want to do here is we want to try to find root notes that are close together. So my root note for the C major chord is at the 1st fret of the B string. And I want to find an F note that's close to it. Now I can find F on the B string up at the 6th fret. And that's not too far away, but we can find a closer F note at the 1st fret of the E string. So that's the chord I'm going to use with my root note at the 1st fret of the E string. And now I have my F major chord. And finally we have the G major chord. So I'm at F and I'm just going to slide this chord up 2 frets. So my root note is on the G note at the 3rd fret, and I have my G major chord. So as you can see, all of our chords are fairly close together. We're not having to move up and down the neck a lot to play the chords. Now the thing about this is we are using different chord fingerings. So it's going to take you some time and practice to get used to going from one chord fingering to another chord fingering. Just as an aside, when you play this progression with the 1, 4, and 5 in it, I want you to keep in mind that we can interchange these numbers to change the progression around, and it works pretty well. So for example, I could change that to 5, 4, 1, where now I start with my 5 chord, which is G major. Then I go to my F chord, and then I finish up with my C major chord. And that's just an example of how we could work these chords. And also, with this 1-4-5 progression, what we can do is we can turn it into 1-4-5-1. So now we'll play the C major chord, go on to the F major chord, the G major chord, and then we return to the C major chord. And we get a little bit more of a complete statement. So that's how we could play that chord progression, starting with our root note on the B string. However, we could start with our root note on other strings. So if we wanted to start with our root note on the G string, we would find our C note at the 5th fret of the G string, and we would apply our major chord fingering, and now we have our C chord. That's our 1 chord. Now the next chord is F. So again, what we want to do is we want to find a root note that's pretty close to where we already are. And I could play the F at the 1st fret, and with the root note at the 1st fret of the E string, and there would be nothing wrong with it. And that's an option that you have. However, if I'm looking at my C major chord fingering, I can see that I have an F note at the 6th fret of the B string. So I'm going to go to that F chord, and we have. And then finally for my G major chord, I'm just going to slide that F chord up 2 frets. So my root note is now at the G note at the 8th fret of the B string. And then just to complete the circle, I'm going to go back to where I started with the C major chord. And of course, we could play this progression starting with our root note at the 8th fret of the E string. So if I find my C root note at the 8th fret of the E string, and then I apply my major chord fingering, I have my C major chord, my 1 chord. Now the 4 chord is F. So I'm looking for an F note that's close to my where I'm playing right now. And on the G string, at the 10th fret, I have the F note. So I'm going to opt to switch to my having my root note at the 10th fret on the G string, and now I have my F major. And from here, I can just slide that up 2 frets, so my root note is at the 12th fret on the G string, and now I have my G chord, and I'm going to return to where I started with my root note at the 8th fret on the E string. So as you can see, depending on where we start, the best chords to play in terms of economy of motion will change. And this is what I want you to start working with. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. There's a lot of chord progressions. I listed a fair amount of them in the video on chord progressions, and there are many, many more. But I just want to go and play one more chord progression, and that is the 1-6-4-5 chord progression. And if we fill in the notes that correspond in the key of C, our 1 chord is going to be C major, our 6 chord is going to be A minor, our 4 chord is going to be F major, and our 5 chord will be G major. So those are our chords. So if we start with our root note B string C major chord, we have C. So the next chord is A minor. Well, if I look closely, I have the A root note at the 2nd fret on the G string. And the beautiful part about this is that if I play my A minor chord with my root note at the 2nd fret on the G string, the C note is in the A minor chord. So I don't even have to move this finger. So this is another thing that I want you to sort of understand. Sometimes, depending on how you change your chords, two chords may share similar notes. So you don't need to necessarily lift your hand completely from the fretboard. What we want to do is we want to kind of leave those notes that the two chords have in common down. So all I would do is add the A note with my middle finger at the second fret of the G string, and now I have my A minor chord. So as you can see, there's very little movement to move between the C and the A minor. Now the next chord is F. So I know that I have the F root note right at the first fret on the E string. So I'm going to switch to that F major chord. And then I'll just slide that up 2 frets. So my root note is at the 3rd fret of the E string. And now I have my G major chord. So as you can see, we could play those 4 chords really, really close together and not have to do much movement. And that's the point of what we're doing. So just to kind of, round things out, let's do this with our other fingerings. So if we start with our root note on the G string for our C major chord, we'll find that at the 5th fret of the G string, and we'll apply our major chord fingering. And now we have C major, which is the 1 chord. Now the next chord is the 6th chord, which is the A minor. And I could go and play the A minor the same way I played it in the last example. However, I do have the note A at the 5th fret on the E string. So what I want to do is I'm going to go from this C major chord fingering, and then I'm just going to go to the A minor chord fingering. And this time I'm just using my ring finger to play the bar. The reason I'm using my ring finger for my A minor chord is because I have decided that I want to use the F note at the 1st fret of the E string. So when I go to move in that direction, there's less movement to get to the 1st fret. And that's why I used my ring finger. And this is something that I want you to think about when you start working with chords, is when you have a bar, something simple like the minor chord bar we're using, you can use other fingers. And depending on which direction you're going to move in, either up the neck or down the neck for your next chord, it can make all the difference. Now, so I have my F at the 1st fret of the E string, and I just finish up the progression by sliding up 2 frets. So now I have my C, A minor, F major, and my G major. And this chord progression is a very, very popular chord progression. It is used in so many songs you wouldn't believe it. And in fact, there are videos on YouTube that talk about how you can play any number of songs using the same 4 chords. And this is one of those progressions that whole songs can be played with. So that's our 1, 6, 4, 5 progression. However, I need to show it with the root note at the 8th fret on the E string. So we're going to start with that C root note and apply our major chord fingering, and we have our C major chord. So now the next chord is A minor. And again, if I do some looking around, I can see that I have the A note at the 10th fret of the B string. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find that root note, and I'm going to switch to my minor chord fingering. However, when I switch to my minor chord fingering, I'm still, the middle finger is still going to play the note that is at the 9th fret on the G string. So when I switch from my C to my A minor, I'm going to leave that middle finger down. And when that happens, that's called an anchor note. And this sort of keeps us in our good frame of reference. We leave that middle finger down. Now we just have to place our other two fingers, and we have our A minor chord. And the next chord is F major. And if I want to stay in the same area, I have the note F at the 10th fret of the G string. So now I'm just going to find that note. And again, what you'll find is that if I go to play this F major chord, my index finger is still playing the note at the 8th fret of the C string, or the C note, which is at the 8th fret of the E string. So it sort of becomes our anchor. So we start with, we're at A minor. So now when we go to switch to our F, we leave that index finger down on the E string, and then we just add the other two fingers on the G and B strings, and we have our F major chord. And finally, for the G major chord, I can just slide this up 2 frets, and then I get my G root note at the 12th fret. So now when I play the 4 chords together in this fashion, I have the C major, the A minor, the F major, and then I have my G major. What I'd like you guys to start doing is I would like you to start practicing your chord progressions and using chord voicing. And it's not something that's difficult. You just need to take your time. You know the notes and you know the chords. And even though you may not be able to find the notes quickly or switch between the chords quickly, we can still work on learning how to voice these chords to make our playing easier. So put in your time, put in your work, and I hope to see you there. Peace.